The thing I can't shake is the red. Not the wildflower red of paintbrush or the low sun washing the limestone, but a clean human red fabric bright as a stop sign peeking through a shallow scrape of earth near the edge of Red Rock Falls. Pine needles stuck to it like eyelashes. A few inches down the ground gave way under my glove, and the carrier slid free straps, clinking like small bones. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from, and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. The smallest details, a color, a knot, a crease, are sometimes all that stand between silence and an answer. In the years before that, find my summers ran on a rhythm older than me. I'd wake before the heat arrived, drink coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in and listen for the first rumble of tires on going to the Sun Road. By 7, the parking lots at the high trailheads began to fill coolers, thunking bear bells, tinkling children counting chipmunks on their fingers. Glacier is a cathedral of noise and hush wind cutting in the passes, creek water gnawing at the rocks, and then sudden pockets of quiet where even your heartbeat sounds too loud. I knew those pockets. I'd spent 25 seasons walking in and out of them. Permit station mornings have a smell sunscreen-wet nylon and the faint chalk of crushed trail dust that rides the breeze. I'd sit with a stack of maps and a pencil with a chewed eraser circling waypoints for folks who meant business. Stove fuel measured to the ounce bootlaces doubled back tent flies tested in the driveway. When I met Elias Marrow the first time, it was a morning like that. He carried his calm like gear, well-worn, useful. He had the look I trust in experienced hikers, not swagger, not nerves. Focus. He listened to my talk about swift changes in weather up near Hidden Lake, and finished my sentence about afternoon winds on the ridgeline without sounding like a show-off. I know that bite, he said, tapping the shaded contour lines. Feels like the mountains trying to remind you who's home. We crossed paths that month the way you do in a small community threaded through a big landscape trailhead. Hello grocery store, wave a nod in line at the coffee shack in West Glacier, where the barista remembered everybody's order. He'd come in with Nora, who was always a little paint-splattered, a sign of her design work, or with their daughter Ivy tucked against his chest in that red carrier. Babies make seasoned hikers soften around the edges. They'd stand there these long into their boot miles, folks, and grin like kids when Ivy blew bubbles at them. Elias kept his carrier spotless, no sunscreen smears, no cracker dust in the seams. The buckles clicked closed with the clean sound of something well-maintained. He liked to say order was a kindness you show your future self. He had a lot of little sayings like that. And they weren't for show. He lived by them. Nora had a placid way of seeing a storm in the distance and choosing her words with care. She'd ask about trail conditions by the day of the week, not just the route, as if she could see how a Tuesday crowd moved differently than a Saturday crowd, how a Thursday thunderhead hit sooner. We talked often about the way small choices, an extra liter of water, a dry pair of socks, were the difference between a long day and a dangerous one. She wasn't anxious. She was deliberate. When you work my job long enough, you learn the difference. July in Glacier is a study in contrasts. You can sweat through your shirt at noon and see your breath at dusk. On clear afternoons, the rock glows. The air smells like sun-warmed juniper and mineral dust. By evening, the cold slinks back down from the snowfields and sniffs around your cuffs. The chipmunks own the benches, and tourists maneuver for the exact angle that turns Bear Hat Mountain into a postcard. I carried an old field notebook in my chest pocket and kept notes that would bore most people's snowmelt lines where the mountain goats were lingering, the first patches of fireweed blooming. Quiet data keeps you honest. We have our rituals. A ranger checks the radios at the end of shift and tops off the truck. Volunteers straighten the laminated trail signs and brush off the map boards. There's an unspoken agreement that we act like every visitor will make it back to the car on time, and we prepare like one won't. The folks you want out there are the ones who can hold both truths in their hands without shaking. I saw the Marrows together on a warm Thursday at the Apgar picnic area early afternoon. The shade was deep and the lake held paddle borders like little commas in a long sentence. Elias was showing Nora how he liked the emergency blanket folded flat with the folded edges nested so it could be shaken open with one motion. Ivy was babbling that musical, nonsensical language that lives somewhere between laughter and birdsong. It drew eyes because happiness does that. A man asked if he could take a picture for them. They declined politely. It wasn't their style. He kissed the top of his daughter's head the way fathers do when they think no one is watching a quick press and lift, as if he could tuck a blessing under her hair and have it hold. When he came by the station on a different morning to double-check his route to the hidden Lake High Meadows, he stood over the map like a carpenter checking a beam. He'd start from the Bear Hat trailhead, leave early to beat the sun on the climb stop in a sheltered notch he liked where the wind died down. If they camped, it would be on a wide, durable pad where the ground stayed firm even after rain. He had backups for his backups. Redundant lighters, water treatment, a repaired stove, and a habit of sending Nora a single photo when he had a bar of signal. Nothing performative, just proof of pace. He gave me a friendly hard time about my caution speech, and I gave it anyway. "I know you know," I told him, "and I want you to hear me say it." He smiled and said he'd want the same for my family. West Glacier is small enough that the evening news isn't a broadcast. It's two people talking at the post office steps. We look after each other by habit. Someone's porch light burns a little longer when their spouse is late. A neighbor walks the dog a second time and circles past your driveway just to keep an eye on things. In July, the sun holds on like it doesn't want to leave. You can wash a truck at 9 and still read a road sign without turning on your brights. There's comfort in that kind of light. The body falls for it, thinks it has more time than it does. On the morning that sits in my memory like a coin pressed into cold clay, I started early, briefed the volunteers on bear activity in a drainage we'd be patrolling, and stopped by the trailhead pullout that looks across to the line where forest gives way to stone. The air was crisp, a clean 58 degree, with the day already promising to climb into the 80s. A 3-point buck stood in the brush, chewing entirely unimpressed by my presence. The lot was waking up Cooler's Boots' laughter too loud during that first excitement of altitude. Elias's rig pulled in steady. Nora stepped out to straighten a shoulder strap on the carrier and set a sun hat down on Ivy's soft hair. She cinched it and stepped back with that satisfied nod I've seen on 1,000 mothers who double-check the details other people miss. They ran through their soft call and response. He patted his pockets, keys, map, water filter, stove, snacks, blanket. She patted the carrier hat, light sweater, tiny socks rolled like coins. The habit of it felt like a blessing and a promise. None of it was for show. It was for Ivy. He looked at me and lifted 2 fingers at his brow in a quick salute. I reminded him, half joke, half rule, to turn around if the wind got teeth up high. He said he knew a lee that caught the morning sun and would time that stretch so she could nap warm. I believed him. I still do. In my office, there's a corkboard where I thumbtack small notes to myself, a date to follow up on a boggy stretch of trail, a permit number to cross-check a reminder to fix a splintering edge on a sign. I stuck a post-it that day, hidden lake visibility good. It was my shorthand for a sky that meant well. I logged my patrol route, filled my canteen, and watched the first wave of hikers snake up the boardwalk until they dispersed among the rocks like drops of water, finding the lines the mountain drew for them ages ago. If you've never watched a trailhead empty, it's like the second hand on a clock you can hear. It clicks. The lot goes from chatter to creak, from motion to stillness, with a kind of soft finality. It feels like a held breath. That afternoon, I ran a routine check near Logan Pass. The wind was up a bit, but not enough to push anyone off their plans. I answered questions about mule deer and wildflowers, and gave a father a quiet warning about letting his boy throw rocks from the overlooks. I stopped at the maintenance shed, signed for a fresh med kit, and called the weather line to confirm the evening forecast. Sun to dusk, dusk to clear. All of it ordinary. In this work, ordinary is a gift. I saw Nora again briefly near closing time. Not to worry, just to drop off a printed mock-up of a trail etiquette sign she'd been tinkering with pro bono. She'd added a little illustration of a goat that made the warning feel less like a scold and more like a neighborly reminder. We talked about how the late light fools folks into forgetting the temperature plummets after sundown. She tucked a lock of hair behind her ear and said she kept a warmer jacket in the car just in case one of those small revelations that let you know a person thinks ahead in the quiet hours when no one's watching. By habit, I lock the permit station walk the lot with a flashlight even if I don't need it and listen to the gravel under my boots. That sound keeps my mind honest, every crunch, distinct, everything in its place. I checked the bulletin board, adjusted a corner of a laminated map that had started to curl, and turned the porch light on for a few more minutes to help a latecomer find their keys beneath a truck. There's trust in simple light, how it threads the distance between the door and the driver's seat, how it says, almost home. Supper that night was nothing fancy. A grilled cheese tomatoes with salt, a cut peach. I keep my radio on the counter even when I'm off shift. It sits there like a sleeping dog, silent until it isn't. The evening news murmured from the TV in the other room, talking about a ball game and a county fair 2 towns over. I stacked my dishes, washed the pan, and stood at the sink long enough to watch the last brightness leave the cottonwoods along the fence line. In the corner of the window, the porch light burned a little longer than usual, making a neat circle on the deck boards, and just beyond it, nothing but night. I went back to my desk for 10 minutes that turned into 30 paperwork, as a way of breathing, and thumbed through my field notebook to mark tomorrow's patrol. I stopped at the page where I'd sketched the hidden lake basin lines, tight from memory, and the shallow draw where the wind quiets. I don't know why I paused there. Maybe it was just habit. Maybe it was the way the house settled with that small wooden sigh old places make when the day lets go. I clicked my pen closed and listened for traffic thinning on the road for that last round of headlights turning down the hill toward town. And then the quiet became the kind you can feel in your teeth. The kind that makes you look up at the clock, and then at the phone, and then across the room where the porch light still on cut a simple bright circle on an empty deck. I stood crossed to the switch and hesitated. It wasn't late, not by July standards. Still, I left the light burning and set my radio a little closer on the counter, close enough that if a voice came through, I wouldn't miss the first word. Outside, the dark pressed against the glass like fog. Somewhere far off, a truck downshifted, and then the night settled back into itself, steady and expectant, as if waiting for something that hadn't quite happened yet. That porch light stayed on all night. I didn't plan it that way. I just forgot to turn it off. When I came into the office the next morning, the air already had that dry mineral scent that rolls off the peaks before noon, and a low haze sat over the valley. The day felt like any other until it didn't. Around 2 in the afternoon, the dispatcher's phone rang, and I could tell by her face it wasn't about a bear sighting or a lost cooler. She mouthed a name across the room, Marrow. My hand was already reaching for the radio. Nora's voice came through, steady at first, the way people sound when they're still trying to believe it's just a delay. Elias and Ivy were supposed to be back before lunch. The car was still in the lot, the baby's car seat in place. No calls, no texts, nothing. She'd waited as long as she could, she said. But it wasn't like him to be late, especially not with the baby. I took down the details by muscle memory, but my stomach had already gone cold. You spend enough time out here and you learn the difference between a call that ends in relief and one that doesn't. I drove to the trailhead myself. The Marrow's Subaru sat where he'd left it parallel to the tree line, spotless as always. There were no signs of struggle, no scattered gear, no tire tracks where they shouldn't be. The keys were gone, meaning he'd locked up before heading out standard practice for Elias. That small act of order somehow made everything worse. It meant whatever happened, it didn't start as a mistake. We assembled the first search team before dusk. 2 helicopters, 6 ground units, a dog team, and me coordinating with park dispatch. The wind was up on the ridge, slicing across the lake hard enough to scatter whitecaps, but the sky was still clear. We traced their intended route 6 miles in moderate elevation open terrain near Hidden Lake. Not a place where people simply vanish. By midnight, we had nothing. No footprints worth noting, no campfire residue, not even a torn thread of fabric. The thermal drones swept every clearing, every drainage where a man and child might take shelter. The monitors showed nothing but cold rock and sleeping trees. I've watched a lot of searches end that way, with technology outsmarted by silence. Daybreak brought the volunteers. Folks from Whitefish, a few from Kalispell, even some regulars who'd hiked with Elias during his workshops. They came with the quiet urgency of people who need to help because the alternative is helplessness. Nora stood among them, clutching a little stuffed bear the way most people hold a radio. She kept her voice level, answering every question I asked. Gear habits, favorite spots, until I got to the last one. Any chance he'd take an alternate route? She shook her head slowly, then whispered, "He always comes back the same way." We covered nearly 30 square miles that first week. The dogs lost scent in a boulder field north of the main trail, but it was inconclusive. The wind plays tricks out there. The helicopters returned each evening with the same report, no visual, no heat signatures. Every night I updated the incident board, moving markers across maps, recalculating grid lines, telling myself it was just a matter of time. But time in Glacier doesn't behave the way it does anywhere else. It stretches folds and finally erases. By the end of week 2, the chatter started outside the park online in whispers that reached even Nora. People speculating about what a survivalist might do if he wanted to disappear. I heard the word off-grid more times than I care to remember. It's an easy story for strangers to tell the capable man who walks into the woods because he prefers it to home. But I'd met Elias. He wasn't running from civilization. He was teaching people how to return to it safely. When the search scaled down, I kept working the paperwork that piles up after every major incident. Reports, debriefs, next of kin correspondence. It's the kind of work that pretends to be practical but mostly exists to fill the space where answers should be. Nora stopped by the office once or twice a week, bringing coffee she rarely drank. Each visit she looked thinner, but her voice never wavered. She said she still felt ivy somewhere like a hum beneath her ribs. I didn't tell her how many parents have said the same thing to me over the years. Hope is its own compass. Sometimes it points north, sometimes it just spins. Months passed. Snow came early that year, hard and sharp, sealing the upper trails under 10 feet of drift. By spring, Glacier had thawed into its usual brutal beauty, and the marrow case had cooled into a line item in a folder marked pending. I told myself I'd file it properly after the new season's training cycle. Then, in April, a hiker from Missoula walked into our ranger station holding something red wrapped in a plastic bag. His name was Caleb Voss, quiet man, electrician by trade, the kind who spends more time looking than talking. He said he'd found it near Red Rock Falls, half buried under loose soil. I took the bag from him and knew before opening it. The nylon was faded, but still bright enough to punch through the dull light of the room. A child's hiking carrier. The buckles were dulled straps tangled, one of the clips cracked clean through. I recognized the make and model. We'd had photos pinned above my desk for months. Caleb said it was sitting in a shallow hole covered by pine needles, as if someone had tried to hide it and changed their mind halfway through. I logged the chain of custody, sealed it for evidence, and called Nora. I could hear the air leave her lungs when I said the words "red carrier." She didn't cry. She just asked, "Was it intact?" I told her it was, and she whispered, "Then someone put it there." I didn't argue. After she hung up, I sat with the carrier on the counter and felt the years fall away. Every search I'd ever led, Every map I'd ever marked it all came back to that single ordinary object, sitting where it shouldn't be. We sent it to the state crime lab in Missoula. The analyst in charge, Dr. Hannah Keene, ran point on trace and environmental testing. I'd worked with her before. She could read dirt the way most folks read handwriting. When her report came through, it upended everything we thought we knew. The fabric wasn't as weathered as expected. 9 months in Montana should have bleached that nylon to a ghost pink and filled it with mold. But the UV damage was minimal, the padding bone dry. The carrier hadn't spent the winter in that hole. It had been kept somewhere protected, then moved recently. That single fact reframed the whole timeline. The carrier hadn't fallen or washed down from the basin. It had been placed, deliberately, maybe even as a message. We started looking backward along the slope, tracing February's records for slides and runoff patterns. Satellite data showed a small mudslide 2 months earlier, minor enough to miss public notice but strong enough to churn debris downhill. The model pointed straight toward a remote drainage above Red Rock Falls, a rough, clawed-out hollow called Stony Creek Basin. I'd flown over it once during a wildfire survey. No trails, no signposts, just cliffs, scree, and wind. A man like Elias might have gone there for shelter if something went wrong. We built a small team, 3 backcountry rangers, a canine handler, and a medic. Nora asked to attend the briefing, and I didn't have the heart to refuse. She sat in the corner, hands clasped, staring at the photo of the red carrier pinned beside the map. "He'd never leave her," she said softly. "If that's hers, then he had no choice." I promised her we'd find out what that choice was. I don't make promises lightly, but sometimes people need words to stand on, even if they crack later. We left before dawn, our breath ghosting in the cold. Stony Creek Basin was as unforgiving as I remembered boulders sharp as broken glass trees leaning at angles that made you think twice about stepping forward. We moved slow, calling out at intervals so the echo would give us distance markers. On the 3rd day, the dog stopped. Juno, black and tan shepherd trained for scent recovery, stood rigid near a curtain of vines. The handler crouched, brushed aside the greenery, and there it was, a narrow opening in the rock, maybe 3 feet high. The edges rubbed smooth by weather. I felt my pulse jump in my throat. We went in single file. The air was dry metallic with the faint sweet rot of decayed fabric. My light caught on a shape near the far wall, a tangle of gray and bone. We'd found Elias. He'd tucked himself into a corner body drawn up as if trying to stay warm. His skull bore a deep fracture and both legs were shattered. It looked like he'd fallen from somewhere high, crawled into the cave, and survived long enough to try. Near his hand lay a rusted multi-tool and a half-empty bottle. What stopped me cold wasn't him. It was what wasn't there. No sign of ivy. No remnants of a onesie or a blanket. Nothing. A father dying in a cave without his baby raised only one possibility, and it wasn't one I wanted to say aloud. Then our medic brushed the dirt near the entrance and froze. She'd uncovered a small knife, the handle wrapped in orange paracord, knotted in a spiral pattern. Not standard gear. I'd seen that exact knot before years earlier on confiscated traps from a man named Amos Reed, a poacher who'd built his living by cutting corners and stealing from the land. We bagged the knife and marked the cave for forensics. Back at camp, I sat by the fire and watched the smoke twist up into the dark. The pieces didn't fit a survivalist's precision, a vanished child, a buried carrier, a poacher's knife. Each clue contradicted the next. But what settled in my chest that night wasn't confusion. It was the quiet certainty that we were standing on the edge of something uglier than weather or accident. When we radioed the findings, I could hear the silence on the other end stretch long before command answered. They told us to stay put until the investigative team arrived. I lay awake listening to the wind scrape across the rocks, thinking about that red carrier and the way Nora's hand had trembled when she saw its photo. The mountain was still, but my gut told me it was holding back. Somewhere beyond that ridge was another story, one that hadn't finished playing out yet. The next morning, before the chopper came, I walked back to the cave alone. The light was gray, the kind that flattens everything into shadow. I crouched at the entrance and looked inside one last time. The air was so still I could hear my own breath bounce off the walls. There was nothing new to see, yet something about the place felt incomplete, like a sentence missing its final word. When I stood, the wind shifted, carrying a faint metallic rattle from somewhere higher up the slope, a sound that didn't belong to nature. I couldn't tell what it was, but I knew it wasn't the end. Not yet. The wind carried that sound for a long moment, metal on stone, faint but sharp enough to slice through the still air, and then it was gone. I stood there, just listening, until all I could hear was my own breathing echo off the canyon walls. Whatever made that noise had come from somewhere higher up, maybe a loose buckle, maybe debris shifting after the night's frost. I logged the location in my notebook and started the slow climb back down toward camp, my boots crunching against rock that felt older than time. When I reached the base, the others were already packing up the last of the gear. No one spoke much. The kind of quiet that settles after a discovery like that isn't grief, exactly. It's heavier, slower, like the mountain itself is holding its breath. The forensic team arrived 2 hours later by helicopter. They moved carefully, stepping over every stone as if the ground itself might tell us something if we just treated it right. Watching them work, I felt that familiar split inside me, the part that wants answers and the part that dreads them. I knew we'd have to open everything, backup reports, radio logs, even the park's old citations. The knife we'd found in that cave wasn't random. The orange paracord was a signature, and it belonged to someone I'd crossed paths with before. His name was Amos Reed. Poacher, trapper, opportunist, take your pick. I'd written him up 4 years earlier for setting illegal snares near Lake McDonald. He'd come at me red-faced and defiant, swearing he was just clearing old wire, but he knew I'd caught him. We confiscated his gear back then, a duffel full of hides, a set of crude tools, and one knife handle wrapped in that same spiral pattern of orange cord. I remember the knot work because it was so deliberate, too neat for a man who claimed he didn't care about details. Reed wasn't a monster, at least not the way people picture one. He was the kind who lived just close enough to the law to believe he owned the wilderness more than anyone else did. That evening, I sat with the sheriff's investigator and went over Reed's file. Multiple citations, no violence, a few trespassing warnings. But the timing gnawed at me. He'd gone off the radar late last fall, right around the same window the carrier must have been moved. When we sent deputies to his trailer near West Glacier, they found it locked and empty. Dishes still in the sink, a calendar open to September, and a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the counter. The neighbors said they hadn't seen him in months. Some guessed he'd headed for Idaho to trap through winter. Others thought he might have drowned in the Flathead, though no one could say why. I didn't like guesses. I wanted tracks, traces, facts I could hold. So we started where the evidence led the cave. The crime lab results came back confirming what we already suspected. Elias had died from his injuries, most likely within 48 hours of falling. But a faint cut along his forearm caught the examiner's eye. It could have been made by a blade. Not a killing wound, just a shallow defensive mark. Maybe he'd lifted his arm, tried to shield himself. Maybe not. We'd never know for sure. What I did know was that his satellite phone, the one he kept attached to his belt, wasn't among the items recovered, and a man like Elias didn't lose track of his lifeline. We contacted the phone provider to pull its signal history. Most were routine pings leading up to the day he disappeared, all lining up neatly with his expected route. Then 9 months of silence until one brief activation at 3:17 a.m. on July 13th, less than a mile from where his body was found. The call didn't go through, but the GPS data was solid. Someone had powered it on after Elias was gone. I brought the data to Nora myself. She'd come to the ranger station that morning holding Ivy's old stuffed bear like it was the only thing keeping her upright. When I showed her the map, her hand went to her mouth. "So it means someone else was there," she whispered. I nodded. I didn't tell her what that likely meant, not yet. If she wasn't with him, she said, then maybe she's alive. Her eyes searched mine for confirmation I couldn't give. I told her we'd keep looking and we would. But I'd been around enough mountains and enough men to know that survival isn't just about luck. It's about who you meet when luck runs out. We pushed deeper into the basin over the next week, retracing runoff paths and cross-checking them with the February mudslide. The terrain was brutal, jagged stone mixed with patches of thawing snow that swallowed your boots whole. Every few hours we stopped to take in the silence, listening for the faintest echo of movement. On the 5th day, one of the younger rangers, Quinn, a wiry climber with good instincts, noticed something odd. About 200 yards from the cave, a patch of soil looked different, looser, like it had been disturbed and tamped back down. He brushed the surface with his glove, and the tip of a plastic bag appeared. We all went still. Inside was a folded map of the hidden lake area, an old flint striker, and a note wrapped in wax paper. The ink was faint but legible, scrawled in a hand that shook from either pain or exhaustion. Ivy, safe. Tell Nora. The signature was Elias's. I didn't need a handwriting expert. I'd seen his letters on permit forms enough to know. The words hit me harder than I expected. Relief, disbelief, confusion, all tangled together. If Ivy had been safe, who had taken her? The only other presence we had evidence of was Reed. We cataloged the cache and sent the handwriting sample for confirmation, though in my gut I already believed it. The idea that Elias might have entrusted his daughter to someone else, anyone else, was both hopeful and horrifying. He'd done what every parent prays they'd have the strength to do. He'd tried to give his child a chance. But to whom Reed? A stranger. A passing hiker. The note gave us direction, but not peace. The sheriff requested FBI assistance given the interstate possibilities and the missing child angle. They brought in digital forensics experts to trace the satellite phone's movement. Within a day, we had our first solid thread. The phone had connected to a tower again, briefly 2 weeks after the disappearance, this time outside the park boundary along Highway 2. That's where Reed's truck had last been seen. The pattern was undeniable. The investigation widened. We canvassed pawn shops, supply stores, anywhere a man like Reed might trade gear for cash. Most clerks shrugged until one in Coeur d'Alene remembered a customer last summer, lean-build, graying hair, who bought baby formula and diapers, paid in cash, and wouldn't look anyone in the eye. The clerk thought it odd because the man had dirt under his nails and boots caked with clay like he'd just come off a trail. He'd driven a beat-up green pickup. The same description fit Reed perfectly. When I told Nora, she broke down for the first time since this started. Formula, she said, half laughing through tears. That means she was alive then. She said it again, quieter this time, like she was trying to convince the air itself. I let her have that moment. In this line of work, hope is dangerous, but sometimes it's the only tool we have left. We kept digging. Reed's history wasn't long, but it was deep enough to tell us who to look at next. He had one living relative in Montana, a younger sister named Leah living outside Libby about 60 miles west. She'd stayed clean, no record, no run-ins, just a quiet life working odd jobs and keeping to herself. But financial records showed she'd withdrawn nearly all her savings around the time her brother disappeared. That detail stuck with me. People vanish for many reasons, but money leaves footprints. The Bureau planned the approach carefully. No raid, no spotlight, just a welfare check under the guise of following up on an abandoned vehicle. I asked to go along. I needed to see for myself what kind of woman might take in a child who wasn't hers. We drove out under a sky that looked scraped raw by wind. Leah's cabin sat at the end of a dirt road lined with pine stumps and rusting car parts. The porch sagged under the weight of years, but there was a tricycle leaning against the railing, its red paint chipped down to metal. That stopped me cold. You learn not to assume in this job, but my throat went dry all the same. When she opened the door, she looked smaller than I remembered from her driver's license photo. thin, tired eyes that carried too many secrets. I introduced myself, mentioned her brother's name, and saw her flinch before she could hide it. I held up an evidence photo of the pacifier we'd found near the ridge, the one coated in pine sap and charcoal residue. "We found this not far from where your brother used to trap," I said. "Do you recognize it?" Her gaze dropped to the photo, then drifted toward the hallway behind her. I heard something, a soft shuffle, the unmistakable clink of a toy hitting wood. A second later, a small child appeared in the doorway. Dark curls, wide eyes, holding a stuffed rabbit. She looked no older than 2. My pulse thudded so hard it blurred my hearing. Laya's voice came out thin, practiced. "This is my niece," she said. "Her name's Clara." The agents exchanged looks, but stayed quiet. I knelt down to the child's height, forcing my voice steady. "Hi there," I said. "That's a nice rabbit you have." She smiled shyly and clutched it tighter. Her eyes, those same blue-gray eyes I'd seen in the photos of Ivy, met mine for a heartbeat, then darted away. In that instant, every sound in the room fell away. I straightened up slowly, met Leia's gaze, and said the only thing that came to mind. "We need to talk about your brother." The air thickened. Her fingers trembled against the doorframe, and her lips parted like she wanted to say something but couldn't. Then finally she whispered, "I didn't mean for it to happen." That was the moment I knew. Not just that we'd found Ivy, but that this story had been carrying a second tragedy all along, one of guilt survival and choices made too late. Outside, the light had started to fade, turning the yard gold and gray. Somewhere down the road, a truck backfired, echoing through the trees. Inside, the only sound was the little girl's quiet humming a tune too soft to recognize, but steady enough to hold the whole room still. We didn't make an arrest right then. Protocol demanded patience, evidence, restraint. But as we stepped back onto that sagging porch, I could feel the story shifting again. The trail that had started with a missing father and his child had just taken us somewhere we hadn't expected to, a woman who might have saved a life and betrayed another in the same breath. I watched the sun slide behind the ridge and thought about that red carrier buried shallow but never hidden enough. Some truths, no matter how deep you bury them, find their way to light. The moment Laia whispered those words, the air in that cabin seemed to shrink. I remember the sound of the wood stove crackling, the faint whistle of wind coming through a bad window seal, and the way the little girl Clara kept humming to herself in the back room, completely unaware that the truth of her life was about to split open. I told the agents to give me a minute alone with Laia. Sometimes when guilt has been sitting too long in a person, you have to let it stretch before it can speak. She sat down on the couch like she'd been carrying the weight of a mountain, and finally set it down. Her hands twisted in her lap. I could see the dirt still under her nails. "He didn't mean to leave him there," she said. Her voice was small, breaking halfway through the sentence. "I didn't rush her. I've learned that people unspool truth the way they lived it out of order, tangled but real. She said Amos had come to her last summer, wild-eyed and silent, carrying a baby wrapped in a torn blanket. He told her he'd found a man down in Stony Creek Basin hurt bad dying. The man had begged him to take the child, said his wife's name like a prayer. "Ivy safe. Tell Nora." Laia looked up at me, her eyes filling. "He thought he was doing the right thing," she said. I wanted to believe that. But I also knew Amos Reed. He was a man who measured right and wrong against what made him sleep at night, not by what cost someone else their life. The agents came back in and began the formal questions, their tone gentle but precise. Where had Amos gone after that? Did he ever try to contact her? Did he leave anything behind? Laia said he'd been gone for months. She thought he was hiding, ashamed or afraid, she didn't know which. She claimed he'd left the baby carrier in a shed out back, tucked beneath a tarp. When the February thaw came, a flood had swept through the property. That's when it must have washed down to the falls. she murmured. It made sense. The mudslide, the shallow burial, it all fit, but in a way that made the story even crueler. Elias had died thinking he'd saved his daughter, and the man who took her had spent the next 9 months running from that act of mercy. The child had gone quiet. I could hear her small feet padding across the wood floor, the squeak of the rabbit toy in her hand. Laya's voice softened when she spoke about her. She called me Mama after the 2nd month, she said. I didn't correct her. I told myself it was better she didn't remember. She looked at me, waiting for judgment. I didn't give it to her. I just nodded because there's no clean line between love and wrongdoing when survival is involved. The social worker who'd come with us moved toward the girl kneeling to her height, smiling in that calm, careful way people use when they don't want to startle a child. Hi, sweetheart. I like your rabbit, she said. The girl smiled, shy and trusting. She had Elias's eyes. That detail hit me harder than I expected. It's one thing to see a photograph of a missing child, another to see those same eyes looking back at you in real time. I stepped outside for a moment to radio in. My hands were shaking just enough that I had to steady the mic against the doorframe. I told Command we had a possible match and were requesting DNA confirmation. The sun was lowering over the ridge, turning the pines into silhouettes. When I went back inside, Laya was sitting still, almost peaceful, now that the secret was finally out. She asked if she could call the little girl to her before we left. The social worker hesitated, but agreed. Clara, honey, she said softly. The child came running, her curls bouncing rabbit in hand. Leia scooped her up, held her tight, and whispered something I couldn't hear. When she handed her back, she turned to me and said, Please don't let them hurt him. My brother. He's not evil, just afraid. I promised we'd find him, though I didn't say what would come next. Promises are dangerous things in this line of work. The next 48 hours were a blur of procedure. The child was placed under protective care and the DNA test was expedited. I stayed close, waiting. When the results came through, the printout slid across the desk like a whisper. Maternal match confirmed 99.9%. Ivy Marrow was alive. I called Nora myself. There was a long silence on the other end, and then the sound of breath hitching one sharp one shallow. She didn't say much, just, Is she okay? I told her yes, and for the first time in months, that word didn't feel like a lie. Nora arrived the next afternoon. I met her at the door of the Child Services building, a plain structure with gray carpet and the smell of hand sanitizer. She carried the same stuffed bear she'd held at the search post, its fur worn thin at the seams. The reunion didn't look like the ones you see on television. There was no rush, no sweeping embrace. Nora stood frozen for a moment, staring at the little girl sitting on the floor stacking blocks. Then Ivy looked up, saw her, and tilted her head like she was trying to place a face from a dream. When she finally walked over, she reached out a small hand and said, Mama? The word was tentative, not quite certain, but it was enough. Nora dropped to her knees, gathered her in, and began to cry in that soundless way people do when they've carried grief too long. I stepped out into the hallway to give them space. The air outside was heavy, warm enough that you could smell the damp earth from last night's rain. One of the agents joined me. He'd been the quiet one, the kind who doesn't speak until he's sure of what he's saying. We've got a lead on Reed, he told me. His truck had been spotted in Idaho, near a patch of logging road that cut toward the border. No arrests yet, but it meant he was alive and still running. In the days that followed, the park felt different to me. I'd driven those same roads for decades, but every turn now carried echoes of Elias's voice, Nora's patience, that red carrier lying in the dirt. The investigation stayed active. Leia faced charges for failure to report, though the sheriff recommended leniency, citing her cooperation and the child's well-being. Publicly, we kept the details quiet. You can't unsee what the world does to a story like that once it leaves your hands. I went back up to Stony Creek Basin one last time before the season turned. The cave was as we'd left it, the markers still tied to nearby branches. The air inside was cool, still holding that mineral smell. I crouched near the spot where Elias had fallen asleep for the last time and set down a small toy, a wooden chipmunk Nora had asked me to leave. She'd said it was the one Ivy had pointed to in their final photo. I placed it gently on the rock beside him, not as evidence, but as acknowledgement. Sometimes closure isn't about answers. It's about knowing you did what could be done. When I stood to leave, I noticed something glinting near the edge of the entrance, half buried under new debris. It was a piece of glass, curved faintly blue, like part of a bottle. I picked it up and turned it in the light. There were scratches along one side, deep and deliberate, forming a few crude letters, AR. The initials were shallow but unmistakable. Amos Reed. Whether he'd left it as a marker, a confession, or just a careless sign of passing, I couldn't tell. But it was proof he'd been there again after the fall, after the cave had gone quiet. I radioed it in, but even as I did, a strange calm settled over me. Reed was still out there somewhere in the patchwork of forest and shadow that stretches from Montana to Idaho. Maybe he was hiding from guilt, maybe from justice. Either way, he was moving through the same wilderness that had taken and returned so much. As I hiked back toward the ridge, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of pine sap and rain. For the first time since the beginning, it felt like the mountain was exhaling. That night, I sat alone on the porch of the ranger station, watching the last light fade off the peaks. The red carrier was locked in evidence, the case files stacked and waiting for a prosecutor's signature, but none of it felt finished. The kind of story we'd walked through doesn't end with paperwork. It lingers threaded through every rustle of wind and ripple of water that passes over the park. Somewhere out there, a man was still carrying his choices, and a child was relearning her mother's face. I thought about all of them, Elias, Nora, Ivy, even Reed, and how in their own ways, each had tried to survive the wild, only to learn that survival sometimes costs more than anyone can pay. I stayed until the stars came out, until the forest turned black and the sound of the creek grew louder than my own thoughts. When I finally shut off the porch light, the darkness felt complete but not empty. It was the kind of dark that listens. And out there, past the timberline, and the roads that end too soon, a single truth waited unfinished, unclaimed, and still moving through the trees. I didn't hear about Amos Reed's truck until 2 weeks after I left that toy chipmunk in the cave. A sheriff out of Idaho called to say they'd found it pulled off a logging road buried halfway under snowmelt runoff. The doors were unlocked keys in the ignition. Inside were a few canned goods, a wet sleeping bag, and a rusted .22 rifle with a broken stock. No sign of Amos. The tire tracks showed he'd driven until the road ran out, then walked north toward the timberline. After that, nothing. We sent a ground team once the snow cleared, dogs and all. They found a boot near the river a month later. Leather cracked, same size he wore. Maybe he drowned. Maybe he kept walking. Some men vanish without permission. Others do it on purpose. Either way, his trail ended there. Leah took a plea. She told the judge she hadn't known what to do, that her brother's fear had become her own. She'd spent 9 months keeping Ivy safe and hidden, feeding her, rocking her to sleep, knowing every day that the truth would find its way to her door. The court gave her a year on probation, no jail time. Nora didn't fight it. She told me she couldn't bring herself to hate the woman who'd kept her child alive. I think that's the kind of mercy that only comes from someone who's already walked through the fire. The morning Nora and Ivy left for home, I helped them pack the car. Ivy sat in the back seat, hugging that rabbit toy like it was an anchor. She was quiet, watchful, the way children are when the world has already proven itself unpredictable. Nora stood beside me, the light catching in her hair, and said, "I still talk to him at night, you know. I tell him she's safe. I nodded. I didn't tell her I do the same sometimes out loud up in the basin, where the wind runs through the trees like a voice you can almost understand. The park closed Stony Creek Basin to the public after the recovery, at least for a while. Too many people came trying to see the cave, snapping pictures, leaving small offerings that just felt wrong. We don't build shrines in places like that. The mountains don't need reminders of what they already hold. Instead, we marked the trailhead with a small bronze plaque, just 2 names, and the date July 2024. Nothing else. The rest of their story was too personal to turn into a tourist stop. By late fall, life in the ranger station settled back into its old rhythm. Radios squawked with weather reports, hikers stopped in for maps and advice, and the smell of pine cleaner hung in the air like always. But I carried a quiet shift inside me that I couldn't shake. For years, I'd treated every case like a problem to be solved, every disappearance as a formula waiting for the right equation. This one broke that pattern. It reminded me that people don't get lost because they make mistakes. They get lost because the world changes faster than they can keep up. Sometimes that change is weather. Sometimes it's fear. I kept in touch with Nora through the winter. She sent postcards from Whitefish, later from Missoula, and finally from a small town on the Oregon coast where she said the air felt clean enough to start over. Each card carried a little drawing in the corner, a pine tree, a mountain, a chipmunk. The last one came that spring. Ivy had just turned 2. There was a photo tucked inside, the 2 of them standing by the ocean wind, whipping their hair. Ivy was holding her mother's hand and looking up, not at the camera, but somewhere beyond it. I pinned that picture to the edge of my corkboard beside a folded map of Hidden Lake. As for me, I stayed on another season. You don't leave the work just because it leaves a mark. Every summer brings new hikers, new stories, and sometimes new absences. When people ask if I ever found peace after that case, I tell them peace isn't the right word. Understanding, maybe. The kind that doesn't make the nights easier, but makes them quieter. One evening, just before the first snow of the next year, I went back to Bear Hat Mountain. The lot was empty, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. I hiked halfway up the trail to where the switchback overlooks the lake and stopped. The light was fading. The water dark and glassy, and for a moment I could almost see them, the 3 of them, the way they might have looked that morning. Elias with the map folded in his pocket, Nora waving from the car, Ivy in that red carrier pointing toward the trees. Just a family starting a day they thought they understood. It struck me how ordinary it all was. How every story that ends in tragedy begins in something so simple, just a choice to step forward. I stood there until the wind turned cold enough to remind me it was time to go. On the way down, I caught sight of something bright along the edge of the trail, a piece of fabric red against the frost. For a split second, my chest tightened, but when I picked it up, it was just a scrap of someone's scarf, faded and torn. Still, I folded it into my pocket. Some habits never leave you. A few months later, a colleague from Idaho called again. They'd traced a skeleton found deep in the timberline back to the Reed family. Dental records confirmed it. Amos hadn't gone far. They found him a mile past where the truck was left near a creek that floods every spring. His campfire had burned out neatly, his pack beside him. No note, no final message. Just quiet. When I heard, I didn't feel relief or satisfaction, just inevitability. It was like the story had closed its own circle without asking permission. That winter, the case file finally closed for good. Officially, it was ruled accidental death for Elias, custodial concealment for Laya, and presumed exposure for Amos. But the paperwork didn't tell the real story. It didn't show a father trying to save his child, a sister trying to atone for her brother's fear, or a mother who refused to stop looking. Those parts live outside the margins in the places where memory and silence meet. Now when hikers ask me about the Marrow case, I tell them it isn't about danger or wilderness. It's about endurance. How people keep moving forward even when the trail disappears beneath them. Elias taught me that. He prepared for everything except what the world threw at him, and even then, in his last breath, he made a choice to save someone else. That choice carried across 9 months, 2 states, and a dozen lives, until a little girl named Ivy walked out of the dark and back into her mother's arms. That's the kind of story that stays with you. Sometimes I drive the Going to the Sun road after hours when the park is empty. I roll the window down, let the night air in, and listen to the sound the wind makes as it moves through the peaks. It's never really silent here. The land remembers. It holds every footstep, every echo, every voice that ever called out and didn't get an answer. I used to think that was haunting. Now I think it's grace, the way the earth keeps the ones we've lost within earshot. The plaque at the trailhead has already started to weather. The bronze has darkened the lettering filled with dust. Visitors pass it every day without stopping, and that's fine. It was never meant to draw a crowd. But once in a while, someone will leave a small red ribbon tied to the post bright against the green. I don't know who they are, but I always pause to straighten it. It's a small thing, but it reminds me that stories like this don't end. They just change hands. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for noise, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Out here, every echo means someone's still listening. And that's all any of us can hope for, to be remembered even in the quiet.